I want to welcome you. I keep sticking to my own shirt, but I want to welcome you to the Metaphysical Bible Hangout. I'm Reverend SherriDeniseJames, creator of this Bible Hangout. We've been doing this now for 6 years. Yeah, 2013. So we are now entering our 7th year of doing this. Is that right? Yeah. I don't know. I can't do my math. We're 6 turning 7. How about that? And yeah, I got, because Jordan was born in 2013, so we are 6 turning 7. And this right now we're in the midst of a really incredible series based on the book that my mentor, Reverend Dr. Mary Tumpkin, put together, A Student's Guide to the Hebrew Scriptures. And this text is amazing because it is one of the things that Reverend Mary cared about was that before you do metaphysical Bible interpretation, you need to know what the text actually says. Don't run away from that. And what's interesting for me, because I tend to stay, and I said this last night in a class that I'm doing for my new teacher training candidates, that the more that I read the Bible, and the more that I kind of dig into it, and I've been reading I tended to stay with the New Revised Standard Version, but I got hired to read the Bible for a actual app that I think I can tell you guys about, that I got to read the Bible for an actual app. And that redoing that, it made me visit the story differently. And they're using the New Living Translation. And in reading it, what was fascinating about it was that I could see how New Thought is trying to get back to that original Hebrew thought about God, where there was no evil, where God was all there is, and that God was intimately active in in the lives of the people, which is what we teach, that God is everywhere evenly present. I don't know that they thought God was everywhere evenly present the way that we talk about it, but this idea that God is responding to you, is responding to the way that you show up in the world. And if you pull off the anthropomorphic elements of God, meaning, God behaving like a human being, but you just look at it as the law in action, it's absolutely what we teach. And I thought that was just really fascinating. So it is, I know these prophets are not easy to go through. I thank you guys for, going through this process with me, because I know that a lot of this language is, the woe to yous and the, I'm gonna smite you and the, all of that stuff. But once we get through it, it's really quite powerful. And so I just, I encourage you to dig into it, hang in there. And so tonight, let me get our PowerPoint. Tonight, we are going to focus on 4 prophets. We'll get as far as we can go with it. Zephaniah, Nahum, I've heard Habakkuk, and I've heard Habakkuk. Pick your pronunciation. The truth is, we don't know at all. We just have kind of some guesses based on what Hebrew sounds like today. And there you go. And then Jeremiah. So that's where we're starting. So Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Jeremiah. And these were the prophets that were during the 7th century. So we're counting down. So we were in the 8th century 2 weeks ago with Micah, Hosea, Isaiah, Joel. That's what I'm missing, and Amos. That's where we were last week. 2 weeks ago, we were with the 8th century prophets, and we're counting down because we're BCE. So we're counting down to 0. So with the 8th century prophets, these were the prophets that prophesied when the Assyrian crisis was growing, but it had not yet been, Israel was still standing. These 4 are now, Israel is no more. Assyria has come in and has basically relocated a majority of the country, and they have lost their ties to their homeland. and we don't know where they are. They're referred to as the 10 lost tribes, or as the lost tribes of Israel. It is the northern kingdom that has fallen under the Assyrian Empire. So at this point, only Judah is still standing, only the southern kingdom. And these are the four primary prophets whose writings survived that we're looking at today. And so we're going to look at Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Jeremiah. Now, Zephaniah, we're going to start there, and we're on page 68. 68. So the book of Zephaniah, Zephaniah prophesied during the reign of King Josiah. He is one of two main prophets who prophesied during the Babylonian crisis. His book is not very long. It's only 3 chapters. I would actually suggest that if you pull up the New Living Translation, you can read it out loud to yourself in about 10 minutes. And it's a pretty fascinating read. And I encourage that, because just the reading of the scripture aloud helps to familiarize you with the story elements. And you get to see how there are things that we pull from different books of the Bible that we use so differently than how they were intended. That the ways that we use them today have nothing to do with what they were intended for at that time. Okay, so the first thing is the long prophetic silence that had existed for 75 years was broken by prophets who raised their voices publicly against the apostasy and the degeneracy of Judah. Now, apostasy is a word, it's a Bible word, but what apostasy is, it means that essentially they've moved away from the faith. Many of us have committed apostasy because we have moved away from what we practiced in our childhood, and we moved into a New Thought tradition, those of us that weren't raised in New Thought. So we left the Methodist Church, we left the Catholic Church, we left the Southern Baptist Church, and we migrated to a New Thought tradition. That's what apostasy is. And so it just means that you left the faith. So what these prophets are saying is that they're coming against those who have committed apostasy, who have moved away from the Yahweh practice. So a little bit of history, so that I give you guys a context. So we talked about the prophets that responded to the Assyrian crisis toward the end of the 8th century, 2 in the north, 2 in the south. Jerusalem survived the siege of 701 when the Assyrians laid siege to it in 701, and that gave this credence to this royal ideology. And you're going to see this like back and forth, this belief that God was with Zion, was with Jerusalem, was with the house of David, and would preserve them. And so even when Judah moves into the next century, into the 600s, it is in a considerably weakened state after the siege. And during that century, the first half of the next century, Assyria actually reaches like the height of its power. In Judah, you have King Manasseh reigning. And King Manasseh, he reigned for 50 years. And we're not sure of the exact dates, but it's somewhere around the 690s to the 640s, of about 50 years. And what's interesting is that the Deuteronomistic historian only devotes about 18 verses to this king who reigned for 50 years. And all of those verses are entirely negative. And so it's in great contrast, because Manasseh's father was Hezekiah and Manasseh's son is Josiah, and they get way more attention. So Manasseh is really kind of seen as loyal to the Assyrian government, and so he is not really respected by the historians. They felt like he was basically a failure to the country because of his loyalty to Assyria. He allowed all kinds of different practices. Remember, whenever the prophets arise, they're always talking about idolatry, meaning worshiping other gods, apostasy, which means you moved away from the faith, or they're talking about injustice. We see a lot of conversation about injustice, because what happened under Solomon is that you had these building projects, and he went on this massive building spree. And what happened is you had the creation of economic classes. And when you had economic classes, now you had rich and poor, whereas before everybody was kind of on an even keel before all of the building projects. And so the injustice was railing against the rise of the rich and the ways that they took advantage of the poor. And so a prophet was always getting up and speaking about that. Now, Assyria actually gets overextended. So it reaches the height of its power, but then it gets overextended. And it actually sets it up so that the countries that it controlled, Judah being one of them, Israel is gone, but the other countries that they control, which were Egypt and Babylon, those countries are able to break away because Assyria is overextended. So Assyria it was the superpower of the day. It had laid control of Babylon. It had also laid control of Egypt. And so Egypt breaks away first, then Babylon breaks away. And so Josiah comes to the throne in Judah in the year 640. And Josiah is the son of Manasseh. And he sees Assyria's weakness and he decides to take advantage of that. And he asserts Judean independence, and he carries out a series of reforms, basically getting the people back to Yahweh only worship in 622. And so he gets rid of the Assyrian religious influences. He centralizes worship of Yahweh only and centralizes worship in Jerusalem. And so this centralization of the religion was probably a political agenda as well, but it helped to assert its independence of Assyria. And Assyria continues to decline toward the end of the century. And in 612, the capital of Assyria, which is Nineveh, is going to fall. So just give you a context of what's happening, that the superpower has risen. All the countries that it has some type of control over are basically able to, which is Egypt and Babylon, are able to break away. So these prophets are prophesying in the light of that. So that's what's happening during that time. Any questions on that I should ask? Because I know I've kind of run through that history, and I know if you haven't heard it before, it's like, what is she talking about? Who's on first? So let me ask, are there any questions on that? I wanted to give you a context of what's happening in the country so that when we hear the words of Zephaniah, the words of Nahum, of Habakkuk, of Jeremiah, they have something to land on. Any questions? Anybody confused? Anybody like, what the heck is she talking about? No, we good?
No.
Okay, VJ.
I am so glad you said what the heck, but I'll leave it alone, okay? Okay? I'm not going anywhere. Thank you.
Basically, so let me put this in modern day terms. So there are ways that we have overreached in America, right? And then we have all of our own internal fighting. For us, it's racially based, but it's just an overextension. Many people in the country are leveraged and in debt, and the country is deeply in debt. And then we have, in our big cities, we have masses of people becoming homeless. Just to give you a comparison, because I thought this was unbelievable. So when I went to Grand Cayman, I learned that the Grand Cayman Islands, that the population is 60,000 people on these three islands. In Los Angeles, we have 75,000 homeless people. Our homeless population is bigger than the whole population of Grand Cayman. And that was just mind blowing. And there are movements afoot, but there's not like the population is growing faster than the efforts to curb homelessness can be addressed. Rents are skyrocketing. I mean, people were in Inglewood, because Inglewood didn't have rent control. Rents were that had been at, say, $1,000 were jumping up to $2,500 a month. And so people were being forced to just, figure it out. So in a very real way, it's very similar to what was happening then in the railing against the rich, the advantage that they take of the poor people because government policies support that kind of action. I'm just trying to give you kind of a, I'm going to mute somebody. Alita, I got a little bit of noise in your background. The government the policies allow for the injustice is what I'm trying to say. The policies allow for the injustice. So this is the context. And then what you have is the countries that were being controlled by the superpower of the day start bucking against that country, basically. And in that instance, it was Egypt and it was Babylon. And so they are able to assert their independence. And because Assyria is essentially overextended, there's nothing they can do about it. And eventually the Assyrian Empire crumbles. The Babylon attacks in the year 612, I think, and basically captures the capital. And once the capital is captured, the country falls to Babylon. And so whereas before Babylon was under Assyrian rule, now Assyria is under Babylonian rule. And in that, they had turned Judah into a vassal state, meaning that Judah had to pay tax to Assyria, kind of like a bully, like a gangster. You got to pay me a tax to exist. And Judah had been able to basically under Josiah assert its independence and basically refuse to pay the tax to Assyria. And so Josiah is very much considered a hero as far as the historians are concerned, because he made all of these reforms. He got rid of all of the Assyrian religious influences, and he brought the people back to Yahweh only worship. And he stopped paying that tax to Assyria. And I'm being redundant, but I want this to make sense, because I feel like there are lessons in what's happening for what we are doing today. And even though we're doing this kind of fact-based walk through the scriptures and we're not doing metaphysical interpretation on them right now, I still feel like there's something here for us to listen to and hear that we can consider for our lives today. All right. Zephaniah was a Judean prophet, possibly descended from the Davidic line. His condemnation of the kinds of religious practices that were eliminated by Josiah's reform suggests that he prophesied before that time. So we know that he was a contemporary of Zephaniah, but Zephaniah puts all of these reforms in place. And so since he's prophesying against the things that Josiah fixed, scholars basically feel like he was probably in there a little bit earlier, that maybe he started prophesying at the time that Josiah's father was king. Some of his prophecies date before basically 622. Those prophecies tend to be pessimistic. They tend to be very grim. Judah is condemned. It's condemned for apostasy, which we talked about. It's condemned for decadence, all of the things that were basically allowed to flourish under Josiah's grandfather. The other thing that we see is that this idea of the day of the Lord. So what arises in the Hebrew mind is this idea that they call the day of the Lord or the day of Yahweh. And they see it as a day of triumph when Yahweh is going to intervene in the course of history and is going to set right the situation that we are God's chosen people. It's not right that our kingdom is being destroyed or being decimated, or we're paying tribute, all of that. And so this hope for the future shows up, and it gets talked about as the day of the Lord or the day of Yahweh. So along with Amos and Zephaniah, those are two of the prophets that are like, hey guys, this day ain't gonna be as great as you think it is. And this idea that it's not gonna be a day of singing and joy, it actually is gonna be a dark day of destruction and despair. And so we see him suggesting that and basically saying you need to get ready. So Typical of other Judean prophets, prophets from Judah, prophets from the southern kingdom, his message covers three main topics: condemnation of Judah and Jerusalem for religious sins. Religious sins were always about worshiping other gods. It was always about not adhering to Yahweh only worship. Condemnation of foreign nations. One of the things that you start to see in the prophets is the rise of this idea that God, that the God of Israel or the God of Judah or the Lord Yahweh is not just a personal God of this country, but he is the supreme ruler of the universe. And so largely you see that when it's a condemnation of the other nation, of foreign nations, it's basically saying that Israel is my chosen people, but I'm the God of the universe and I will take care of you. And so you see this more and more in the writings of the prophets. And then you also get promises of salvation for God's people. And so all of these prophetic books kind of look the same in that way, meaning that they start with a prophecy on you guys are doing wrong. Then they speak out against foreign nations. You're trying to take advantage of my people is kind of the gist of what God usually says in these texts. And I'm gonna deliver my people. And then there is this promise of hope that if you turn away from the ways that you have been acting, that I will reward you, I will prosper you. And so all of the prophetic books, almost without exception, kind of follow some similar format. The words might change here and there, but it generally is, you guys are behaving and, you're not practicing Yahweh only worship. But I'm still holding accountable these foreign nations that are also acting against you. They're not going to get away with it. And then the promise of if you turn away, you will receive all, and turn back to me, you will receive all the good that has now been withheld from you. Constance says, so like omnipresence, universal source. Yes. You see this rise of the idea in the minds of the prophets that God is not just the God of Israel, but the God of everyone. And so the condemnation of these foreign nations, it's this idea that God is not just local. And at that time, that was a very unique idea, that God was the God. Gods were local. If you left a land, then you were governed by the God of the new land that you were in. And so this idea of God being universal to all people, you see it begin to rise in the people, this evolution of thought, which was different before because God was more localized before. So again, you're seeing evolution in the God thought, evolution in the understanding of God. Unlike Amos, Hosea, or Isaiah, Zephaniah was probably attached to the temple and liturgical rites. Let me tell you what that means. What that means is that he was probably employed by the government, by, say, the Judean government. And that's significant. So he's like a whistleblower. That's the best way to describe it. Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, they're outside the government. They are not they're not paid to prophesy, if you will. But Zephaniah is on the inside. He's tied to the temple and the liturgical rites. So this is somebody from the inside who is speaking out against what it is that he's seeing. It is believed that his series of oracles were delivered at a festival celebrating the kingship of Yahweh. Celebrating the kingship of Yahweh. That's what goes in that blank. The central theme of his prophecy was the nearness of the day of Yahweh. You'll sometimes hear it, day of the Lord, or the day of Yahweh. And I'm going to read to you from Zephaniah 1:15 to 18. I thought I was, hold on.
And then I will be their God, and they shall be my
Zephaniah.
people. And no longer will they need to teach one another and say to one
Zephaniah, where are you, Zephaniah? (15 to 18). So this is what he says. The great day of the Lord is near and coming quickly. The cry on the day of the Lord is bitter. So he's basically saying, you guys think that it's going to be a day of triumph. Let me tell you, it's not going to be that. The mighty warrior shouts his battle cry. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the corner towers. I will bring such distress on all people that they will grope about like those who are blind because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood will be poured out like dust and their entrails like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath. In the fire of his jealousy, the whole earth will be consumed, for he will make a sudden end of all who live on the earth. So he is painting this picture of utter and complete destruction and darkness. And this is in contrast to what the people believe, because there's a going thought that the day of Yahweh is going to be this day of triumph when God intervenes in the course of history and sets everything right. And Zephaniah is like, no, that's not how this thing is going to go down. It's going to be bad. Zephaniah has a worldwide vision, and you just heard that. Basically, in the fire of his jealousy, the whole earth will be consumed. It's like, I'm not just taking down Judah for its apostasy, for its idolatry. The whole world will be decimated. His oracles warn all who are worshipers of false gods wherever they may live. So his thing, again, he's speaking out against worshiping false gods. And this is, again, why it's believed that he prophesied before Josiah came to power, because Manasseh, Josiah's father, allowed those Assyrian influences. And so the people, it would be like, this might not be the example, but whatever, I'll give it. It would be like, we've got this belief in a world that works for all people. And then you get someone like a Kanye West who's walking around with a MAGA hat on, and the people are saying, we can't deal with him. You always have people, when another group is in power, that identifies with the group in power. There's always that group. And so Manasseh is seen in that way because he becomes loyal to the Assyrian Empire that has basically weakened Judah. So an outline of the book of Zephaniah. So Zephaniah's prophecies, they tend to be very pessimistic. They tend to be very grim. Judah is condemned for apostasy, decadence, all the things that flourished in the King Manasseh. God is wrathful, and his wrath is imminent. There will be universal destruction. All life, animal and human, will be exterminated. And like Amos, Zephaniah saw the day of Yahweh not as a day of triumph, but a day of dark destruction and despair. And so you have the oracles from chapter 1 to chapter 2 and a portion of chapter 3. You have the beginning of chapter 2. You have oracles against the sins of Judah. And then for about 11 verses in 11 or 12 verses in chapter 2, you have oracles against enemy nations or the foreign nations. And then chapter 3, verses 9 to 20, you have the promise of deliverance. What's interesting about the promise of deliverance that you find in chapter 3, because he has been so dark in chapters 1 and 2, that when you get to chapter 3, and he starts giving these so he's giving you this prophecy where things are going to be bad, right? Things are going to be bad, and the whole earth is going to perish, right? That's what he's saying. Everything is going down, basically. That's how he sees it. And then he gets to chapter 3, and this is what it says. Then I will purify the lips of the peoples, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshipers, my scattered people will bring me offerings. On that day, you, Jerusalem, will not be put to shame for all the wrongs you have done to me, because I will remove you, your arrogant boasters. Never again will you be haughty on my holy hill, but I will leave within you the meek and humble. The remnant of Israel will trust in the name of the Lord. They will do no wrong. They will tell no lies. A deceitful tongue will not be found in their mouths. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid. Sing, daughter Zion. Shout aloud, Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your enemy. The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. On that day, they will say to Jerusalem, do not fear, Zion. Do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love, he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. I will remove from you all who mourn over the loss of your appointed festivals, which is a burden and reproach for you. At that time, I will deal with all who oppressed you. I will rescue the lame. I will gather the exiles. I will give them praise and honor in every land where they have suffered shame. At that time, I will gather you. At that time, I will bring you home. I will give you honor and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes before your very eyes, says the Lord. Now, he just said a couple chapters earlier, basically, I'm killing everything. I'm killing you, and I'm killing the foreign nations. I'm gonna lay desolate the entire earth. This passage is so jarringly positive that scholars think that there had to be either an editor, a later scribe, or somebody that went and wrote those positive words, because he's so pessimistic and so dark in the first and second chapter that when you get to those last verses of chapter 3, it's like, well, who wrote that? Like, where in the heck did that come from? That is crazy. So it actually, or it's in response to the reforms that Josiah initiated. So it's like one or the other. Either there was another writer that came in and wrote it, or this, he prophesied what he said earlier in chapters 1 and 2 in the beginning of chapter 3 before Josiah came to power. And then Josiah came to power and began to institute these reforms, because when Josiah comes to power, that's when they find the book in the temple. It is considered the law. Scholars think that it's the book of Deuteronomy. Josiah realizes that his dad had not been faithful to Yahweh, and he realizes how the nation has messed up. And he starts to basically clear away all of the idols and get all of those, purge the country out of that. So one or two things happen. Either there's another editor that came in and wrote that last piece, or there was this break in between, and what we got as a document is the mashup of all of his prophecies, but there's a time difference between chapter 1, chapter 2, the first 8 verses of chapter 3, and then the last 12 verses of chapter 3. So anyway, just thought you'd find that interesting. I found it interesting. It was fascinating to me. Any questions on Zephaniah? Any questions on that? Anything that doesn't make sense? Are you following? Is this clicking? Is this sticking? Got it. Joe says she's following. All right. Okay, good. All right, let's keep rolling. So now we come to Nahum. So this is another really short book. So it's a short book, but what's interesting about it is that it's actually a series of 3 poems that rejoice over the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE. So remember what I said. I said that Assyria is a superpower of the day. They reached their height in the middle of the 7th century, about 650, 640, somewhere around there. And but then they get overextended and are not able to maintain their dominance. VJ says, wow, much of the crazy I have heard all my life begins to make sense. Good. So they've reached the height of their power, and then they're overextended, and so they cannot maintain control over Egypt, Babylon, Judah, and all the other nations that they have. Egypt breaks away first, Babylon breaks away second, Judah breaks away, and then ultimately Babylon grows in strength, and it goes and captures Assyria. The capital of Nineveh is Assyria. And so when the capital falls, Nahum, this prophet, he writes these 3 poems. And what's different, remember what I said about the books of the prophets. The books of the prophets kind of follow a format that they start out and they speak against the sins of the people. Then they speak against the sins of foreign nations. Sometimes it's intermixed. It doesn't have to go in that order. Sometimes it's mixed in sin against God, sins of the foreign nations, sin against God. It just depends on the text. And then it always kind of wraps up with this promise of deliverance. And if you turn back, if you quit your wicked ways, I will deliver you. But what's different about Nahum is that it's actually this book of poems. It's a series of 3 poems. The first one is an acrostic or an alphabetical poem, where each line begins with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And these poems, they rejoice over the fall of Nineveh in 612. When Nineveh was the capital of the cruel Assyrian Empire. And something else about Assyria, they were really widely hated in the ancient Near East. They were noted for their exceptional brutality, their inhumanity, particularly in their conquests and empire building. They deported populations wholesale. They were guilty of all sorts of atrocities like mutilating their captives. They would butcher women and children, all sorts of horrendous deeds. And so we have a lot of testimony about this, both in Assyrian sources, but also in other ancient Near Eastern sources too, as well as in artwork. So art is the artwork of that time testifies to the cruelness of the Assyrian Empire. And so with Nahum in this poem, he's celebrating the avenging and wrathful God who is finally turned around to destroy this terrible enemy of Israel and indeed the world. And according to Nahum, God did use Assyria as a tool. So I'm sorry, that was something else that you see. So the Deuteronomistic historian sees the fall of Israel and then subsequent fall of Judah as the law bringing the just rewards to Jerusalem and to Judah and to Israel for their apostrophe, for their idolatry. So it's kind of like saying, you reap what you sow. And so Nahum is very much in that. He used Assyria he saw God as using Assyria to discipline the kingdom of Israel and to discipline Judah for Judah's sins. But God is ultimately the universal sovereign. And so Assyria's savagery, even if it was part of God's disciplining of his children, Assyria's savagery is itself something that must be punished. And so for Nahum, the fall of Nineveh is God's vengeance upon Assyria for her barbaric inhumanity. Milena says, you once stated that the states were akin to Assyria. I still think that. I still see so many parallels between Assyria. I mean, you kids in cages, deposing dictators, installing puppet governments. Absolutely, 100%. They say there's nothing new under the sun, and there really is nothing new under the sun. And And so I can definitely see, some of the things that are happening right now. I mean, right now, in not necessarily predicting the fall of the U.S. government, but the world has kind of moved on. The world has kind of moved on, and the type of power and authority that the U.S. had, that's gone. And the world is changing as well. So just demographically, the world is shifting. The World Health Organization in 2015 or 2016 issued a report, just looking at birth rates across countries. And what they said was that, so for example, Japan's birth rate is at an historic low, just in the history of the world. And not Japan, yes, but China as well, because China had the one-child policy, and the one-child policy, and it favored boys. So right now, men outnumber women 34-1 or something, like some ridiculous number, some ridiculous ratio. So the World Health Organization, which monitors what's happening around the world, issued a report, and they, based on current trends, and if nothing else changes, that by the year 2050, 1 in 4 people will be of African descent. By the year 1 in 4 people, think about 25% of the population of the earth will be of African descent. Now, of course, everybody's of African descent, but I mean what they look like, not like phenotype. 1 in 4 people will be of African descent. And will be African, excuse me. And that's massive. That's a massive demographic shift. And so the world is just changing. You have populations that were emerging economies that were not a factor. But you've got the BRIC nations, Brazil, can't remember the other nations that are in that, but these rising economies. And so the world is shifting. The world is shifting. And so, I feel like we need to shift with it. I think that we need to open up our view of the world. I think that sometimes we approach the world as if we're still in 1953 with the things that we fight about and things that we fuss about. And the world has changed. And we've got to catch up and change the way that we think. Today, you can go do business in any other country that you want to without leaving your own home. And you should be creating businesses and creating things that solve problems for other people in other areas of the world, and thinking differently about yourself, that our wealth is no longer locked by racist policies. It was never locked by racist policies, but for sure, the way the world is now and the way that you're able to create community. I mean, listen, I don't think anybody on here tonight is from Los Angeles. The world has changed, so our viewpoint has to rise in accord with a new world, and it's, well, anyway, I'm not gonna get into a political thing because I try to remain apolitical, because I feel like what I'm teaching is for everybody. I don't care who takes it. I think that everybody is divine, and whether you're showing up racist or not. So anyway, let me keep going with Nahum. So the prophet Nahum provides a different view of the times of Reformation. His writings are directed mostly against the evil of Assyria. So you do not find him railing against the sins of the people the way you find with other prophets. The book of Nahum only has 3 chapters. Like I said, it is poetry. It's 3 poems, the first of which is an acrostic poem. It contains mostly angry and impassioned hatred for the Assyrians. Mostly angry and impassioned hatred for the Assyrians. Impassioned hatred is what goes in that blank. Because the book is so unified, it was probably written or spoken on only one occasion, maybe at like a festival or something like that. One occasion is what goes in that blank. And so the outline of the book of Nahum, the book is praised for its very vivid poetic style. It doesn't contain prophecies, like I said. It doesn't upbraid the people for their failings, which are two things that most of the other prophets do. And so in terms of an outline, chapter 1, you get this picture of Yahweh coming as a divine warrior to punish idolaters and to deliver Judah from its enemies. So it's this poetic acrostic that is about God coming in to deal with Assyria. Chapter 2 describes the battle of Nineveh. And so that's what you're seeing there, with, hold on, I want to get to that. No. Nahum. So I want you to hear some of this language because it's quite fascinating. So this is the fall. And this is what it says. And again, it's almost like he's rejoicing at, what's happening. An attacker advances against you, Nineveh. Guard the fortress. Watch the road. Brace yourselves. Marshal all your strength. The Lord will restore the splendor of Jacob, like the splendor of Israel, though destroyers have laid them waste and have ruined their vines. The shields of the soldiers are red. The warriors are clad in scarlet. The metal on the chariots flashes on the day they are made ready. The spears of juniper are brandished. The chariots storm through the streets, rushing back and forth through the squares. They look like flaming torches that dart about like lightning. Nineveh summons her picked troops, yet they stumble on their way. They dash to the city wall. The protective shield is put in place. The river gates are thrown open, and the palace collapses. It is decreed that Nineveh be exiled and carried away. Because remember what happens with Assyria, when they capture, they relocate people. That was what happened. That's how we get the lost tribes of Israel, because they decimate the country by basically taking the people away and resettling it. And so here, Nahum is saying, it is decreed that Nineveh be exiled and carried away. Her female slaves moan like doves and beat their breasts. Nineveh is like a pool whose water is draining away. Stop, stop, they cry, but no one turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. The supply is endless, the wealth from all its treasures. She is pillaged, plundered, stripped. Hearts melt, knees give way, bodies tremble, every face grows pale. Where now is the lion's den, the place where they fed their young, where the lion and lioness went and the cubs with nothing to fear? The lion killed enough for his cubs and strangled the prey for his mate, filling his lairs with the kill and his dens with the prey. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will burn up your chariots in smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will leave you no prey on the earth. The voices of your messengers will no longer be heard. I mean, he is like giddy, like, yeah, God's gonna get you. Let me just, you know how they have that meme where the person gets the popcorn? I can just, if they had popcorn back then, Nahum's got some popcorn and he's like, yep, get him, God, go ahead. Let me sit back here and watch. And then chapter 3, it mixes battle scenes with the reasons for God's wrath. So it gives kind of some explanation of why God is doing what he's doing. He's doing. Any questions on Nahum? Any questions on Nahum? Anything that's not making sense? Are we following? So make sure you guys are tracking. Jonathan says, any significance on the term young lion? You know, I'm not sure. I would have to look that up, because the lion's den is really associated with Babylon. When Daniel is put in the lion's den, and one of the things Reverend Mary taught me is that you always know a people by the way they conquered. So Assyria, whenever they conquered, they would mutilate, they would resettle the people, do stuff like that. Babylon was different. They would cart you away into exile, but they would put you in service to the government. So all the people that were smart, they would put them in service to the government, doing good work. It wasn't like, it was a different type of exile. You weren't, they didn't beat you or mutilate you in the same way. You weren't free, but it wasn't the same type of exile that Assyria practiced. So I don't know what the lion's den means. It seems to suggest that they did some stuff with the lion's den, but I don't really know. I'd have to look that up. Constance says he was in that serve you right attitude. I'm telling you, he had popcorn. Nahum had some popcorn and a good soda, and he was sitting back like, yeah, God, get him. Let me just sit here and, or y'all know that Kermit meme where Kermit is sipping some Lipton tea. So anyway, all right, moving on. So now I want to get to Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk was written during the period that leads right up to the destruction. But Habakkuk is interesting because like Nahum, it doesn't contain any prophecies, but actually it's rather this kind of philosophical musing on God's behavior. It's a really interesting thing. It's almost, I wrote in my notes that Habakkuk is kind of like a letter to God. Like just trying to understand like what's going on, trying to make sense of it. Habakkuk, he lived shortly after Nahum, and he describes a time when Babylon was taking over the Near East. So Babylon has not yet taken over Judah. It's going to, but it has not yet taken over Judah, but it conquers Assyria, who has fallen. So Habakkuk is prophesying during this time where Babylon is growing in power. And wait a minute, hold on. So in Habakkuk chapter 1, it's like he's trying to make sense of this thing. He wants to understand like why like he's questioning God's judgment. Like, whereas the Nahum felt like God used Assyria and then later Babylon as a way to discipline Israel and Judah, Habakkuk is like, this don't seem right. Like the punishment seems excessive. The destruction of Israel and then the ultimate destruction of the temple by Babylon. So where you no longer have the temple, which is which was the central place of worship in Jerusalem. And Habakkuk is just like this doesn't make any sense. So like I said, it doesn't contain any prophecies. It's just kind of musing on God's behavior, and it's kind of a poetic language between the prophet and Yahweh. And like in the first chapter, Habakkuk chapter 1, he says, how long, O Lord, shall I cry out and you not listen? Shall I shout to you violence and you not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? Why do you look upon wrong? Raiding and violence are before me. Strife continues and contention goes on. And then skipping down to verses 13 and 14. You whose eyes are too pure to look upon evil, who cannot countenance wrongdoing, why do you countenance treachery? Talking about what's happening to Judah by these other nations. And stand by idle while the one in the wrong devours the one in the right. You have made mankind like the fish in the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler. And so essentially he's questioning, this idea that God is using the foreign nations to discipline Judah and Israel. And so Habakkuk is known as the questioning prophet because he wants to understand God, the morality of God's actions. It's kind of like I know you guys see this in your centers, those of you that are active in New Thought churches, that you'll have people come in and will be teaching about the law, the infallibility of the law, that you reap what you sow, plant good seeds and you will reap good seeds. And then you have somebody come in your center and they're like, okay, but what's going on in Dallas where this young man is killed like shortly after he testifies against a cop? Or this dude comes in somebody's backyard and shoots this woman with a single bullet through a window and she dies in front of her 8-year-old nephew. And it's like, miss me with that, you reap what you sow. So that's what's happening with Habakkuk. Habakkuk is like, no. Well, this is not adding up for me. I don't know if I buy this idea, because I'm looking at all of this destruction. And so the first chapter of Habakkuk is really a question to God, like, yo, dude, do you see what's going on? This guy, he goes into a church in Charleston and he shoots 9 people, and then they take him to Burger King. The cop, yeah, she's convicted, but she probably is going to be out. She's already filed her appeal. The key witness is dead, and they hugging her in the courtroom. Come on now. So this is Habakkuk. Habakkuk is like, nah, miss me with all of that. Okay. So that's his conversation with God. He wants to know how long God will continue to allow those who are even more wicked than Judah to hold the upper hand. How long is God going to allow those who are even more wicked is what goes into that. And so, what was I going to say? Habakkuk is, no, I need to come down. So God responds to Habakkuk's questions. So that's what's happening in the second chapter, by saying that the Babylonians are instruments of his justice, even though they ascribe their might and their success to their gods rather than to Yahweh. And now we've already seen in other books this idea that a conquering nation is serving as an instrument of God's punishment. But Habakkuk doesn't couch this idea in a larger argument that Judah deserves this catastrophic punishment. And so this is the difference between him and some of the other prophets, is that he doesn't buy this idea of God using these other nations to discipline Judah. And so he really struggles with that. And so he wants to know, God, why? And he says in the first five verses of chapter 2, like after he asked God, like, how is it that you're looking at iniquity? Your eyes are too pure to behold iniquity. How is it that you're looking at all of this happening? Like, make this make sense. And then he's like, okay, this is what he says. I will stand on my watch, take up my station at the post, and wait to see what he will say to me, what he will reply to my complaint. The Lord answered me and said, write the prophecy down, inscribe it clearly on tablets so that it can be read easily. The righteous man is rewarded with life for his fidelity. How much less then shall the defiant go unpunished? Not a terribly deep answer. The righteous simply have to have faith that justice will prevail, and this faith has to sustain them through the trials that challenge the very idea. And so we're going to see this again when we get to Job. We're going to get a little bit of deeper answer than what is given. But basically, this is what, we use the verse Habakkuk 2:2, write the vision, make it plain, to say God said, write it down. But really, it's in response to Habakkuk saying, what is going on? What is going on with what's happening here? Jonathan says, this is the theodicy thing. Yes, theodicy meaning the problem of evil. What do we do with this problem of evil? Yes, absolutely, 100%. He concludes that the faithful must hold on until the purpose of God is revealed. That's kind of it. Something I will tell you, that in that third chapter, the third chapter is so hopeful compared to the questioning nature of chapters 1 and 2, that here again, scholars think that this shift in tone and shift in theme means that there could be another writer. in chapter 3. It may be that, some editor basically attempts to respond to Habakkuk's skepticism, that Yahweh will bring justice, and so that's why he's waiting. This image of an avenging God answers Habakkuk's opening question: how long will God stand by and watch while the Babylonians rape and pillage? But on the other hand, it's possible that it's Habakkuk himself. And again, the book exhibits that same paradoxical tension that we've seen through a lot of the prophetic books. And so in terms of an outline for this book, it's 3 chapters. It's not very long, and I would definitely recommend reading it aloud to yourself. Is really good if you get the New Living Translation. It reads in like plain English, and it's a really interesting, again, if you've ever struggled with the question of what's happening with all of these racist attacks, what's happening with this injustice, that these were the same questions that Habakkuk had, and he took them to God. And so that's why I think of the book of Habakkuk as almost like a letter to God. And what happens is that he witnesses 2 attacks on Jerusalem by Babylon. He doesn't see the suffering as a result of their sins, not sins, that's a typo. He struggles with what appears to him to be a basic lack of justice. And then the 3rd chapter, again, shifts so dramatically that scholars think that it was added by a later writer. And so chapters 1 through chapter 2, verse 5, you get a dialogue between Habakkuk and God. And then chapter 2, verses 6 to 20, you get these 5 woes against a wicked nation, against the other nation, kind of like God's response to Habakkuk. And then in chapter 3, you get this lengthy liturgical poem that wraps up, I think, in a really interesting way, because it's almost like he resolves that I'm going to trust God. That's essentially it. And it's really powerful. If you go to Habakkuk 3, at the very end, verses 16 to 19, excuse me. Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 16 to 19. And this is what it says: I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come against the nation invading us, speaking about Babylon. Though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. And so it ends with this poem that basically says, I'm gonna have to go with trusting God. So we'll stop right there. We didn't get to Jeremiah, but next week we'll pick up with Jeremiah, and we will also talk about the reaction to the Babylonian exile, if we get into that, which is Lamentations. I want to go back to Psalm, I think it's the 137th Psalm. Hold on, let me make sure. It might be the 37th Psalm. Yeah, the 137th Psalm. So some of the Psalms, they are said to be written by David, but we know that only some of them are written by David. And one of them that is this pain and despair as Babylon is basically taking down Judah is found in the 137th Psalm. And it says, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. So at this point, the temple is destroyed. So first they laid siege to it. They installed a puppet king, Zedekiah. Zedekiah rebels against Babylon, and they come in and they decimate the temple. The temple is no more. The central place of worship, the place where you go to worship, is gone. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept. As we thought of Zion, there on the poplars, we hung up our lyres, instrument. For our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. And so it's a really powerful psalm, because it's just dealing with the fact that my connection to my homeland is gone, meaning my connection to my God, not just my homeland. My connection to my homeland is gone. And I was thinking about that when I was, preparing for this. I was thinking about that in relation to Africans that were brought to this country. And I don't mean Africans that are immigrating to this country, but people that are African American. And this idea of just being cut off, like there's no, for the most part, none of us know where we could go back to, quote unquote, if we decided to. There is no country to lay claim of, that it has essentially just been cut off. And I was thinking about what was happening with the Judeans in relation to what happened with Africans that came to this country, and just what that meant. And one of the ways that the people survived is that they began to write. And what they wrote ultimately changed the course of history, because we're studying that Bible. But I think about that in relation to these Africans in America that have no longer have any real connection to their homeland, wouldn't know what country to go back to, no people to go back to, no practice to go back to. Of course, things survive, but no practice to go back to, and what that means for people, and how essentially the Judeans had to figure out how to forge ahead now that the place where they do their central worship, which is the temple, is no more. It is destroyed. And how do they define themselves? It's just an interesting, I don't know. I just see so many parallels, and I tell me if y'all see that or not. I don't know. But it's an interesting parallel to me. Jonathan says a lot of these edits would make sense if tied to the rise of the rabbinical tradition in Judaism. I don't really know a lot about the rabbinical tradition in Judaism, so you'll have to educate me. I don't know a lot about that. That's not my area of expertise. But I can research it. I can go find out. Any other questions? Any comments? Is this history making sense? Is it sticking? Is it to feel relevant? How about that? Let's go there. And you can unmute yourself. For sure. Oh, yes, I could ask Dr. Coleman. Yes. I could reach out to him. Absolutely. Any other comments, questions? Thank you, VJ. She says, thank you, Reverend Sherri, for an awakening night. Good. God is so good. I do, Jonathan says it does feel relevant, and I appreciate the connection to the African-American experience. Yes. I was going to share something else with you guys. All right, I'm blanking on it. All right, if there is nothing else, then I will see you guys next week. I'll have the video up tonight on YouTube, on Facebook, and I will see you guys next week. I want to encourage you. I think in my email, I guess I should plug this. I have my clothing line, and I love it. I'm so excited for it and proud of it. And so if you want to support me, you can make a gift. It's free will. This is always free to everybody, whoever wants to attend. But no, I'm not on Patreon. I'm not set up on there. But the links, if you want to support, whether you want to buy a shirt or I have these handy totes. I'm so proud of my totes. I carry them around with me. I carry my books. This is like my book bag that I carry around with it. It's got the Bible Hangout on the back, hashtag pour the oil. And it is the way that I am pouring the oil, and sharing, and learning to use my gifts, where the exchange of my teaching is not just me talking and sharing, but it is also on t-shirts, it's on mugs. I should show you my phone. Oh, my phone is over there. I've got iPad holder. I should show you because it's actually kind of cool. Hold on. I should do that. Because it's absolutely one of my favorite things. So I have my iPhone case that says I am my own miracle. So I'm really excited about that. So I encourage you to consider purchasing something, and that support goes to make this take this all around the world. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you for tonight. And I will see you guys next week. And we'll pick up right with Jeremiah on page 71. And we'll also talk about Lamentations. Good night, everybody.